Hey, what's up? Continuing the Confederate naval series here, the New Vanguard series by these two Scottish guys. The Confederate Blockade Runners. Really good book. As usual, with the New Vanguard, you got great art. You have the pencil, the pen and ink sketches of the time. You got the early photography. And you also have, from the artist, you have the great painted schematics of these interesting ships that people are not really aware of, the blockade runners. Now, they're set up for of course, in the Civil War. Immediately as the war begins, the Anaconda Plan is put into effect, or at least started, where essentially they were going to strangle the Confederacy by blockading their port cities, okay, both in the Gulf and in the East Coast. And also they were going to try to, seize the locations on especially the Mississippi River, literally cutting it in half. And the advantage that the Union, the Federals had, of course, was they actually had the whole Navy. The Confederacy was an agricultural, new nation, with almost no industrialization around, exporting, of course, cotton. And that was basically blockade runners were going to have to get past the blockades, both to get the exports out and to bring supplies in. Okay? And of course, there was a lot of dealings with Britain, England. There were many companies that made deals with the Confederacy, to buy the cotton and to give them the stuff. So, interesting. They start out, piecemeal, trying to do what they could. And eventually they made dedicated blockade runner ships, but they didn't make them. They made them mostly in England. Okay? In terms of its relative success, I mean, the Confederacy had no chance. But by the end of the war here, the blockade ended. And we'll go through the numbers here. Out of 1,300 attempts to run the blockade, by around 350 blockade runners, of these, all but 300 of the attempts were successful. So they were actually pretty successful. Okay? I mean, nearly half of them were destroyed or captured at some point, but they managed to smuggle in a decent amount of stuff. Okay, of course, the exports, less than 20% of the pre-war cotton exports. It wasn't enough, but for what it was fairly successful venture, and I like that it was truly a joint venture. Okay, between Southern businessmen, the new Confederate government, and private companies, British companies, shipping companies. Eventually, they tried different kinds of ships. Particularly, they had a Charleston-based firm, John Fraser Company, and its senior director, Trenholm. Right, the subsidiary company of Fraser, Trenholm and Company. An office in Liverpool. Also an office in New York. Liverpool and New York were actually probably more sister cities than even New York and London were. First place you went when you left New York back in the 19th century, that you landed in England, was Liverpool. Right? 9-day trip. Anyway, and so they managed to approach. You had the bureau here to how to basically for Confederates to sell the materials and buy stuff overseas. Of course, the Union hated that. But the British government didn't stop it. Okay? They were trying to see which way the war was going to go as well. Right? Now, of course, the strategic situation relatively early in the war, you had like Beaufort, South Carolina, Jacksonville, Florida, St. Augustine, one of my favorite places. They already were captured on land, and that was the issue. Okay, eventually you would lose a port city just to troops occupying it, and you lost that juncture, and you see how that affected things. Where eventually, of course, with the British, many of the Confederates would go into like Nassau, right, the islands of Nassau in the Bahamas, Barbados, right, and even Havana. So let's look at some of the blockade runners here. You see that you'll notice that the design for these ships, they had to be steam powered ships. They had to move quick, right? They had to get out and get in. Right? You look at it, you get some of the pencil sketches. Let's look at some photos. Right? Let's see it. I'll show you some more sketches. You see, when you actually look at them, they look semi-futuristic. I'll say steampunkish, but we got some of the ones here. So we got converted blockade runners. What they found eventually when they were building these things, right? When they started making the dedicated ones, the banshees. Right? Look how cool those were. Those were made in Liverpool, right? You had to have a long, narrow ship made of metal, mostly made of metal. These were not. They had no armaments at all. You didn't fight. When you got caught, the jig was up, or you ran aground and tried to get close to the Confederate fortification so they can come out and try to claim it, right? But that was it. You see a nice schematic design here. The sail ships just weren't fast enough. And here, look, like I said, look kind of anachronistic, actually. But anyway, of course, some of the famous ones. The Kate, she made 20 successful missions back and forth. The Robert E. Lee, right? Because eventually they were originally private, but eventually the government had to start getting involved and taking control of some of them. The Robert E. Lee made 14 successful trips. So did the Banshee, right? So I guess some cool things here. Now you got the whole strategic situation, right? You had Havana, right? You see Havana. You got Nassau, right, in the Bahamas, funky Nassau. And you got Bermuda. These were great places for the blockade runners to come out, especially in the Carolinas, where they kept these ports open for most of the war. Of course, the famous Charleston and Wilmington, North Carolina. These are the two big bases because the Federals hadn't taken control of those areas. Of course, Charleston, was always blockaded, so it was always a battle, right? Savannah, it was made impossible to get to. So, of course, New Orleans was taken. Galveston and Mobile were heavily blockaded, so Havana was less of a popular spot. It was really Savannah and Wilmington, because when you went through there, you had a chance. So you get some more pen and ink here, right? You had monitors, right? Because they were trying to stop them getting in and out of Charleston. So to contain the Confederate ironclads in the port, right? And here's one where the British built, as most of them were, forced ashore, North Carolina coast near Cape Fear, right? So here you see the garrison. So a lot of times the blockade guys would try to capture the ship or sink it, and a lot of times they would just run for it. They would say, you know what, just crash into the shore as close as you can to the Confederate forts or whatever, and the garrisons would come out and they would salvage it. A lot of the stuff, as you can imagine, was done at night, right? A lot of the stuff was done at night. Camouflage was used in some of the colors, some of the interesting color schemes you had, some of the early nautical camouflage. Thought that was interesting. Right. And here's an example of, the main patrol line was 2-3 miles out to sea beyond the maximum range of the Confederate coastal guns, right? Once a blockade was runner, like flares were used, right? When you would try to intercept, the blockade runners were much quicker, right? That's why it was pretty successful. They were much faster. They were kind of, especially the dedicated blockade runners that they were making in Scotland and Liverpool at the end were really, they were kind of like the latest technology, right? If she was spotted, right, and the Confederates on the shore would try to support them, with a cover fire, right? And if they were driven ashore, the soldiers and the artillery would try to race there to try to get it out. So it's an interesting little battle there. There's the Robert E. Lee, one of the more successful ones. It's interesting too. As usual, as you'll see with the commerce raiders, the crews were made up of like Southerners, British guys, apparently a lot of Germans, right, and then others, and you'll find also a lot of Yankees. And like I said, these were not warships. They had no armament. You had no time. You weren't standing and fighting. You were running. You were trying to get in and out. And like I said, fairly successful. And as the war turned, many of the companies sort of backed off or abandoned the Confederacy. But the original company there, was it Trenholm? I'm trying to find the page where it's at. Right. They were loyal to the end. They were trying to the end until the blockade was done and the war was over. So, yeah, Port of Nassau in the Bahamas was a haven throughout the war. Yeah, so, it's funny, right? All these Star Wars justice warriors. Oh, they run the blockade with the Millennium Falcon. Well, the Confederates were actually doing that against the evil empire. Oh, okay. So, but very interesting seeing that. I expected to just see like regular looking boats that weren't special looking, and a lot of them, like I said, they look weird. They look very futuristic, and they were. And these were some of the Banshee, I believe, the one made in Liverpool, was the first metal hulled ship to actually make that trip across the Atlantic. Very interesting. So, there you go.